Hello, and welcome to a bonus box of Warhammer 40k's Grim History from the Beyond. I'm Zeckthar, and this week we'll be continuing Darnath Lysander's story and his dealings with the Crusade of Thunder. Now, to give a brief recap of where we left off, Chapter Master Vladimir Pug had punished Lysander for his actions on Taladorn by having him demoted temporarily to captain of the Third Company, while his Sergeant Julian would take over the command of the First Company. With Vladimir Pug's edict, momentum for the Crusade of Thunder began to grow. However, Lysander's command as yet consisted only of some 30 warriors, and the battle barge Storm of Wrath. It was a foundation of a mighty force, but little more. The Third's losses would have to be replenished before the campaign could truly begin. 7 sergeants had been lost on Taladorn, and, for the most part, the replacements were chosen from those brothers who had survived that battle. Sergeant Garadon was surprised when Lysander consulted him about which the Third Company's warriors were most suitable for promotion. One of the reasons for Lysander's censure was because of Garadon's testimony. As with almost every word that passed between the two at that time, the conversations were stilted and awkward, with both men making a poor show of hiding their mutual dislike. Nevertheless, Garadon experienced the first sparks of a begrudging respect for his new captain, if only for the professionalism with which he took his new duties. This grew further when Lysander confirmed that he was content for Garadon to remain in position as Squad Primus Sergeant, and even offered a grudging apology for the previously threatened demotion. Garadon took both of these things with much the same ill grace as they were offered. Now, in the end, though, several of the vacant sergeant positions were filled by survivors of Taladorn, 2 by sergeants from the 7th Company, and 1 by the respected Sergeant Odin, a 1st Company veteran. With the appointments determined, the replenishment draft began. Many of the 3rd Company's new warriors, some 60 battle brothers in all, came from the Reserve Company, Captain Jonas's 7th Company, which had itself recently returned from a campaign amongst the Ghoul Stars, contributed almost 40 tactical marines, which at Lysander's instruction were divided amongst the battle-worn squads. Thus, no unit would be manned entirely by less experienced warriors of the reserve companies. The remaining inductees were scouts that Lysander personally selected from the 10th Company. He took only the most promising recruits, those of the irascible Captain Monteith, considered ready to make the transition to full battle brother. These, like the inductees from the reserves, were spread throughout the company. All told, the flurry of drafting and reassignment brought the 3rd Company's roster up to its official strength of 105 battle brothers, plus support personnel and transport crew. Chaplain Markov, preserved from injury on Taladorn by the Emperor's grace, and by the force field within his rosaires, relished his company's restoration. He prowled the Storm of Wrath's decks in search of infractions performed by battle brothers used to the laxer ways of the chapter's other chaplains, whom Markov mistrusted for the weakness he imagined them to possess. Brother Conrath, preserved from the second death by his armored sarcophagus, had been carefully restored to full function by the chapter's tech marines. He was joined by another dreadnought, Brother Macon, who had been awoken from slumber specifically to lend his might to the crusade. Upon learning that Macon had once been Lysander's sergeant, Garadon wondered whether Pug's command stemmed from the desire to allow the captain an old comrade, or because the chapter master believed that Macon's influence would ease Lysander's stubbornness. Regardless, with the ranks of the 3rd Company filled, Lysander requested, and received, an honor guard of 1st Company Terminators. He also requisitioned some 30 Centurion war suits, several Vindicator and Predator battle tanks, and the Land Raider Legend of Roma. Not content with that, he then convinced Captain Monteith to assign 3 of his scout squads to the strike force, and Captain Hagen to part with 3 of the 5th Company's precious Stormtown gunships. Only when the last of these attack craft were secured aboard the Storm of Wrath did Lysander at last order the battle barge to break formation with the phalanx and head out into the tides of the warp. And thus the Crusade of Thunder had begun, but none of those who set out upon the voyage knew where it would end. Now, as soon as the Storm of Wrath was underway, Lysander set aside all but the most vital of his captain's duties and assumed the role of the drill sergeant he had once been. At the best estimates of the battle barge's navigators, it would take 15 solar days for the vessel to reach its destination, and Lysander intended to put every moment of that time to good use. A portion of one of the battle barge's decks was given over to a firing range, and Lysander now pressed it into almost constant service. The walls of this chamber were lined with the same adamantium plating as the Storm of Wrath's outer hull. Nothing short of a macro cannon shell could have dented it, and the bolt gun volleys that now roared across the gloomy chamber did little more than to scratch it. Lysander worked ceaselessly, instilling into the 3rd Company warriors the same lessons that Sergeant McCon had once drummed into him. Imperial Fist doctrine had long ordained 20 separate observances for the ritual of firing a bolt gun, and a further 6 for the replacement of a spent magazine. Most were little things, silent litanies that the Battle Brothers quickly learned to perform out of habit. Individually, they took little toll of time and concentration, but together, they dulled reaction time and accuracy by a slender but noticeable margin. Squad by squad, Lysander announced a nullification of a full 15 of these observances, and decreed substantial modification to 3 others. He then drilled his battle brothers ceaselessly until this new litany settled into their minds as firmly and instinctively as the old. Lysander pursued this course with forthright passion, sleeping little and brooking no questions to his orders. It was plain to Garridon that his captain was a driven man, but he could not divine whether this drive stemmed from the need to atone for the harm he had wrought upon the 3rd Company, or from a desire to be unshackled from the company and return to command of the 1st. Whatever the reason, Garridon could not argue with the results. A solar week into the journey, reaction time and bolt gun accuracy had markedly increased. As a result, when Chaplain Markov made angry complaint to the sergeant about Lysander's breach of tradition, Garridon found himself giving his captain full support, a standpoint that surprised him almost as much as it did the chaplain. By the time the Storm of Wrath emerged from the warp, the 3rd Company was as fine a weapon of war as Lysander could make it in the time available. Now it was time for the weapon to be tempered in battle. Now, according to the Imperial Fist records, the Magor Rift comprised 2 planetary systems in close proximity to a vast belt of debris, the remains, or some scholars have hypothesized, of a 3rd star system. A 4th system, Vaishan, was thought to lie further to the galactic east, but warp storms had severed it from the rest of the Imperium for more than 40 standard years. Of the 2 systems that remained, the Jandara system was believed to be totally bereft of life, whereas the Kalin system was home to an Imperial agri-world. Indeed, the lush agri-domes of Kalin II had made many years provided food not only for its neighbors, but also for several nearby hive worlds. By all accounts, it had been a rare paradise in a galaxy too often beset by terrors, a latter-day parallel to the Eden of ancient myth. Alas, it was a paradise no more because of one simple word: Orks. The Storm of Wrath and its supporting fleet re-emerged into real space in close proximity to Kalin II, and in the midst of the starscape clogged with drifting wreckage. Though no one aboard the battle barge knew it yet, the astropathic distress hymnal that had reached the Imperial Fist had been waylaid in the currents of the warp. Thus, a conflict Vladimir Poog had considered to be in its early stages had, in fact, already raged for many solar months. As the Imperial Fists arrived, the remnants of the 95th Cadian Shock Troop Battle Group strove against the greenskid tide on the planet's surface. The surviving vessels of the Imperial Navy, dispatched from the orbital shipyards at Nemea, fought to blockade the near-constant flood of Ork cruisers that warped in system from some unknown base. This was not a true war. Not yet, but if it were allowed to gain momentum, it could yet threaten sectors further afield. As the Storm of Wrath's captain guided the battle barge skillfully through the debris field, Lysander made contact with the general of the Cadian army. Or rather, he tried to. Gathering reports from several junior officers, Lysander learned that the defense of Kalin II was all but over, and the 95th Battle Group as good as destroyed. Of some 100,000 Imperial Guardsmen that had deployed to the planet, scarcely 3,000 remained. Most were entrenched around Chivinal, the planetary capital, giving the last of their strength to defend the refugees, who were all that remained of Kalin II's civilian population. The rest of the planet lay in Ork hands, with ramshackle soot-belching factories nestled amongst the remains of the ruined agri-domes, providing a seemingly unending supply of battle wagons and crude Ork combat walkers for the ongoing assault on Chivinal. Without further delay, Lysander divided his company into 2 separate forces: Strike Force Anvil, containing the bulk of the 3rd Company's tactical squads, as well as its storm talons and battle tanks, bolstered the defenses around Chivinal against the continuing greenskin assault. Meanwhile, the remaining warriors would fight as part of Strikeforce Hammer and assault the Ork factory complexes, choking off reinforcements. Garradon expected Lysander to take command of this second force, for it was there that the greatest opportunity for glory lay. He was therefore somewhat surprised when the captain gruffly announced that he would instead assume command of Chivinal's defense. Thus, as much of the 3rd Company put their newly honed bolter drill to use from Chivinal's Battery Fur Creek rampart, Garradon led Strikeforce Hammer out in the once verdant wasteland. Now, superficially, no two of the Ork factories were alike, with chimney stacks, mech workshops, and weapons emplacements arranged seemingly at random within the tumbled walls of the old Agri domes. Yet careful reconnaissance by Garradon's scout squads confirmed this assumption to be inaccurate. Beneath its skin of rusting buildings, the heart of each facility shared a certain commonality, constructed as it was around a sparking reactor, which fed everything from the piston-driven gates to the tractor cannon batteries that made orbital bombardment of the factory a suicidal proposition. Though the defense around the reactors were sufficient to prevent simple sabotage by the scouts were able to conceal locator beacons amongst the ramshackle structures, enabling a series of precision drop pod assaults into each factory's vulnerable heart. During the voyage to Callan, Lysander had not been satisfied with the overturning the 3rd Company's established bolter drill. He had ordered one of the Thunderhawk gunships retrofitted to accommodate a large number of Centurions. The artificers and tech marines aboard the battle barge were scarcely less appalled at the decision than Markov had been by the captain's other changes, but they had complied nonetheless. Now, Sergeant Garradon put them to good use. As the rampart of greenskin dead and mangled wreckage around Chivinal grew ever higher, Garradon brought ruin to each of the Ork factories in turn. Each assault began simple enough, with a storm of wrath enduring the fury of the factory's tractor cannon batteries, just long enough to fire its drop pods at the target. Descending too quickly for the Ork weapons to track, the drop pods slammed into the factory, disgorging Garradon's strike force into the very heart of the complex. There, Garradon's own tactical squad, as well as the strike force's 2 dreadnoughts, destroyed the anti-air batteries, whilst the company's assault and devastator squads, now piloting Centurion warsuits, deployed via Thunderhawk gunship and destroyed the reactors. With the factory's remaining defense batteries silenced by Bower loss, Thunderhawk gunships launched from the Storm of Wrath were able to extract the strike force before they were overwhelmed. Soon after, the battle barge moved into orbit once more to commence the saturation bombardment, pummeled the factory and the half-finished war engines within to dust. Garradon's audacious assaults were carried out with incredible speed and precision, often with only a matter of solar minutes between the first drop pod launch and the echoes of bombardment dissipating through the bedrock. Even so, there were casualties. A swarm of Daka jets scrambled during the assault of the factory complex designated Callan Epsilon, delaying the Thunderhawk extraction for several minutes. A number of the tactical marines and Centurions were lost in that assault, although 2 of the pilots escaped by abandoning their warsuits before being overrun. 2 scouts were captured during the reconnaissance of Callan Zeta, and though Garradon altered his plan to allow their rescue, one later died of his wounds, and honored brother Makan sustained damage that took the Storm of Wrath's tech marines many days to repair. In the meantime, Lysander's Demi Company had suffered its own losses. Chaplain Markov had lost an eye, though he swung his Angel of Sacrifice as wickedly as he ever had, and claimed he saw the foe better with one eye than he had with both. The Predator Glorious Redemption was irrevocably scrap, blown apart by Stampa's death cannon. Veteran Sergeant Odan was dead, hacked to pieces while single-handedly holding a breach in Chivinal's outer wall, as were 6 of his battle brothers, and every warrior who held the line at Lysander's side bore fresh scars as proof of their valor. However, Strikeforce Hammer's efforts had a swift and noticeable effect on the Ork war effort. With the Nemean blockade fleet denying reinforcements from off-world, and their factories destroyed one by one, the Ork assault on Chivinal slackened. This in turn allowed Lysander to assign ever more of his own forces to Garradon's command. By the time the last factory, designated Callan Kappa, had been destroyed, Garradon's assaults were performed practically at company strength. Uniting once more under Lysander's command, the Sentinels of Terra brought the last remnants of the Ork invasion to battle on the Gansha plains. The war boss perished beneath Lysander's thunderhammer, and the survivors fled into the hills. Though the Orc threat to Callan was seemingly ended, Lysander and Garradon both knew that the Crusade of Thunder was not yet done. Orc battleships still tested the Nemean blockade. The war would only be done when their origin point was located and destroyed. Now a hint as to where that was came during the assault on Colin Row, when Garradon's strike force had rescued a handful of human slaves. They had been pressed into service in the workshops, performing tasks too delicate for orcs and too important to be entrusted to unreliable grots. Less than half of the slaves were of Kellanese stock. The others had been brought from the hive world of Vishan. Some of the Kellanese distantly recalled they had provided supplies to Vishan some 40 Terran years previously, before the warp storm had severed all contact. With the presence of Vishan slaves on Colin, none of whom were past their 13th standard year, that the warp storm had clearly ceased, and the Third Company's next destination was clear. Leaving Callan's fate in the hands of the surviving Imperial Guardsmen and the Nemean blockade fleet, the Storm of Wrath left orbit and set course for Vishan. As the battle barge hurtled through the warp, Lysander took stock of his casualties. At his order, Scout Squad Banner was dissolved, and the composition of his remaining squads reordered. 8 neophytes, who had already received the Black Carapace, were granted the power, armor, and roles of the fallen Battle Brothers. Sergeant Banner himself assumed the late Sergeant Odin's command over Squad Secondus. 5 of the Centurion war suits had sustained heavy damage during the factory assaults. Of these, only 3 could be brought to reliable function, no matter how diligently the Tech Marines performed the rites of repair. So Lysander ordered these suits sealed in the warship's armory until such time as they could be returned to the Phalanx. With no information concerning the forces awaiting them at Vishan, Lysander had ordered the Storm of Wrath to re-enter real space beyond the system's edge, past the range of whatever detectors the Orks might have constructed. This quickly proved to be a wise choice. No sooner had the battle barge arrived at Vishan than its aspect arrays lit up with greenskin vessels. A vast of hulk hung in orbit around Vishan's innermost planet, and scores of other warships were scattered throughout the system. These ranged in size from cruisers, similar to those that the Imperial Fist had witnessed in action at Kelin, all the way up to slab-sided battleships. Storm Raven reconnaissance flights later confirmed that 7 of the 8 worlds were airless and uninhabitable rocks. Vishan 1, on the other hand, swarmed with greenskins. Indeed, there were easily enough orcs on its surface to challenge a task force of the Crusade Thunder's size. Challenge, but not defeat, at least if all other things were equal. Sadly, this was not the case. The Orks had not sat idle during their solar decades of enforced isolation. After crushing Vishan 1's defenses, they had ransacked the world of its mineral resources, causing such tectonic instability that the hive cities had long ago been consumed by angry seas of lava. However, in as close a geosynchronous orbit as the Orks could achieve was a space station of vast size. Once the docking port for supply freighters carrying Vishan's ores to distant manufacturing worlds, it now blossomed into a star fort, bristling with orbital shipyards and docking bays, and made planetary assault entirely impossible. Cruisers streamed to and fro between the system's outer edge and the star fort, returning with plunder from distant worlds. Clearly, Colin was not the only planet to have suffered the predations of Vishan's Orks. As Lysander ordered the Storm of Wrath's fleet into a concealed orbit behind the meteor-battered ruin of Vishan 8, Sergeant Garradon saw his own irritation mirrored in the captain's face. Operating alone, the Sentinels of Terra had little chance of driving the Orks from the Vishan system entirely, but it would take time for other forces to assemble, and in that time, the Ork fleet would continue to wreak havoc across the sector. Yet as Lysander ordered Postulary Darsway to request assistance from the Nemean fleet, still in blockade position around Callan, Garradon got an idea. Now, sometime later, 3 Castius assault rams departed the Storm of Wrath's bays under Thunderhawk gunship escort and bore down on a lone Ork vessel. It had taken several solar days, and much of Lysander's patience, before a suitable ship arrived. For its appearance, the cruiser was built around the hull of a captured Luxor-class freighter, and it was Garradon's hope
that the vessel's original Imperial systems and engines would be intact. However, it was the vessel's comparative isolation that made it a viable target. Approaching the cruiser from behind the sensor shadow cast by Vashon 8's moon, Garradon launched his attack. The assault ram struck the vessel amidship, and Garradon's breaching force charged forth to claim the ship. At the same time, the Thunderhawk escort roared ahead, their sensors reconfigured to jam any distress call sent from the beleaguered cruiser. In the end, such precautions proved unnecessary. The cruiser's captain overestimated the tenacity of his crew, thought a mere 30 assailants would be easily overwhelmed, but he was sorely disappointed. After a short but bloody fight, the cruiser was in Garradon's hands. With the vessel secured, the Thunderhawks ferried the rest of the company aboard, along with the Storm of Wrath's first officer and enough autonomous servitors to man the ship's helm and engine room. Thus manned, the cruiser headed deeper into the Vashon system. It was a long and tense voyage. Everyone, from Lysander down to the raw scout, knew that the cruiser wouldn't last long if the ruse was discovered, at which point the 4 Thunderhawks now lashed down in the dock's bays would be the only chance of survival. Nevertheless, fate smiled upon the Third Company. Between the anarchic and often erratic behavior of the Ork vessels and system, the apostolary Darsway, drawing upon the mystical powers of the chapter relic known as the Bones of Osrak to cloud the Ork's suspicion, and the cruiser sailed on unharassed. Only when the Third Company's pure-loined vessel made final approach to the Starfort's docking spur did discovery seem inevitable. But Garradon had planned for this. As the sergeant's command, Darsway contacted the Storm of Wrath, which had made its own leisurely way in system, to the very edge of the estimated Ork sensor range. Thus far, the battle barge had gone unnoticed, but that changed as its captain brought the mighty vessel's engines to full power and bore down on the nearest Ork battleship. The response was immediate. The comm channels instantly jammed as, driven by equal parts enthusiasm and outrage, dozens of Ork vessels came to new headings and moved to intercept the intruder. All at once, the Third Company's captured cruiser was forgotten amongst the anarchy. At Lysander's command, more power was coaxed into the engines, and the cruiser set on course for the central docking spur. Millions of Terran miles distant, the Storm of Wrath, the first stage of its mission completed, broke off from its attack and drove hard for the outer system. The Orks, unaware that the battle barge had only ever been intended as a lure, gave reckless chase, their vessels increasingly strung out as the fast pulled away from the slow. No one aboard the captured cruiser had any inkling of the Starfort's docking procedure, but it had never been Garradon's intention to make such an attempt. Instead, the cruiser tore into the docking spur in a matter of a vast boarding torpedo, its prow shearing through dozens of decks before buckling under the incredible pressure. Hundreds of Orks died in the impact, some crushed by the cruiser, others blasted out into the void by their own atmosphere before pressure doors clanged shut across the ravaged dock spur. Before the cruiser had fully come to rest, the Third Company blew its external hatches and began their assault. Minutes later, they were through the first pressure door and into the undamaged section of the docking spur. Klaxons blared as the Imperial fists fought their way through the Starfort. Lysander, the Dreadnoughts, and the Centurions led the way, a vanguard of 9 impenetrable armor and blistering firepower that swept early resistance aside with almost no effort. They advanced at a relentless pace, bolt guns and las cannons blazing, trampling wounded Orks as they came. Behind the Centurions came the tactical and scout squads, senses alert as they slew any greenskins left alive by the Centurions' advance. Squads Ortez and Lorimar, both understrength following their assault on the cruiser, had remained behind with the vessel's crew in order to protect the priceless Thunderhawks and prepare them for flight. Every battle brother knew that the advantage surprise would carry them only so far, and that their sporadic attempts at defense would soon coalesce into something much more dangerous. Nevertheless, they took heart from the fact that though they were outnumbered several hundred times over, the confines of the Starfort prevented the Orks from bringing their numerical advantage to bear. Time and again, the greenskins came bellowing through the refuse-clogged passageway, only to perish by the scores as bolt guns roared and las cannons blazed. Garradon's plan, as endorsed by Lysander, was a simple one. If the Third Company could fight their way to the command deck, they could use the Starfort's own thrusters to set it on a doomed orbit, thus relying on Vashon 1 itself to destroy its despoilers. Once their mission was accomplished, The Imperial Fist would escape via Thunderhawk gunship and rendezvous with the Storm of Wrath, which was due in turn in system once more. With the Starfort's formidable weaponry disabled and the Ork fleet spread out across the Vashon system, escape would prove difficult. But, as Garridon had explained during his briefing to the rest of the company, the Imperial Fist did not waste their time on easy endeavors. Those could be left to the Ultramarines. The Space Marines encountered their first real resistance at the junction between the docking spur and the main body of the Void Station. Hundreds of Orks waited in ambush amidst the cluttered wreckage of what had once been a shuttle bay. Following Lysander's lead, the Sentinels of Terra disdainfully advanced into the storm of shoot-a-fire, trusting to their power armor's fortitude, even as their own weapons culled the foe. Heavier sounds joined the deafening chorus as snaz guns and cannons were brought to bear, but still, the Space Marines came on. Yet the Imperial Fist were suffering casualties too, and flashes of yellow armor could be seen amongst the jagged scraps of metal and greenskin dead. Brilliant light flared, and white-hot energy lanced across the chamber. Warned by some instinct, Garridon dove clear. Brother Coron's reaction was slower, and the beam punched clear through his breastplate, killing him instantly. The Ork who had fired the shot perished a heartbeat later, as one of Squad Cord's snipers put a bullet through his forehead. However, other greenskins brought up similar weapons, and for the first time, the Third Company's advance slowed as they were forced to seek cover. Even as Garridon directed his squad's return fire, a part of his brain noted that the energy weapons were like no Ork technology he had ever encountered before. The design was more efficient than was typical for greenskin manufacture, and, although each had undergone a degree of customization by its owner, there was a common design visible beneath the extra sights, grips, and barrel extensions. But Garridon abandoned his analysis, sighting along the Spartian's barrel. The bolt pistol flared, and an Ork fell stone dead before its fingers could tighten on the trigger. The gunners were retreating now, driven back by the murderous volleys of bolt gun fire. But the attack was far from over. With an echoing cry of a new wave of attackers came barreling down one of the access corridors, sluggers firing wildly as they closed. Without a word of command being uttered, the Third Company's fire shifted, and dozens of Orks were thrown backwards into their onrushing fellows. A death dread lurched out of the horde, buzzsaws swinging to decapitate Brother Minos. With a metallic bellow, the mechanical monster came on, crushing its fellows as it sought other intruders to kill. Unfortunately for its pilot, Lysander was the next Space Marine to cross its path. There was a screeching noise as the buzzsaws scraped across the captain's storm shield. A trio of booming clangs quickly followed as the Fist of Dawn struck two of the walker's arms from its body, then stove in its torso. Then, as quickly as the attack had begun, it was over, the surviving Orks retreating deeper into the Star Fort. Lysander drove his company hard after that, not wanting to give the Orks the time to mass another attack. Gormuk, the boss of the Star Fort, was growing increasingly concerned. He had expected the intruders to fall back before his fearsome new weapons, but they had kept coming. Gormak himself had felled two of the attackers and winged a third, but he had retreated with his boys when the Space Marines had refused to fall back. Finally, Gormak made his last stand on the command deck itself. Built on a grand scale entirely typical of its Imperial origins, the chamber could have accommodated a Warlord-class Titan had one been assembled within. Gormak had taken full advantage of the space and had mustered every Ork he could within, so that every platform and walkway was crowded with greenskins. As the tactical squad and dreadnoughts laid down suppressing fire, Lysander and the Centurions formed up around their tech marine, Brother Karazhan. Without breaking step, they formed a marching wall of ceramite that escorted him to the instrument panel, almost unrecognizable under the Orky improvements. The escort held firm as Karazhan worked, ignoring the shells crashing against their armor. Again and again, Gormak roused his lads into roaring charges across the command deck, only for the assault to disintegrate as Garridon poured fire into their flank. Here and there, more of the strange energy weapons flashed, but no technology could fully compensate for Orkish inaccuracy. Many of the shots went astray, and no Ork managed a second. Sergeant Cord's sniper reserves their fire for only such targets. Battle raged, and still Brother Karazhan was at his work. Bolt guns ran dry, and spare magazines were taken from the dead so that the living could fight on. Gormak drove floods of grots into the fight in the hope of making the Space Marines waste their remaining shots. But the maddened wretches were hammered down with fists and gun butts. Death Dreads and Killicans were unleashed, but the devastator Centurions calmly targeted each in turn until they were reduced to smoldering and blackened metal. Nevertheless, the Space Marines were badly outnumbered. If Karazhan could not complete his work swiftly, they were surely to be overwhelmed. Then, the orbital thrusters at last began to fire, their labor sending tremors through the deck. Now, Gormak did not fully understand what the Space Marines had done. Nevertheless, he saw the stars beginning to move through the command deck's armor glass dome, and realized that his mechanics needed to reverse the changes the invaders had made. That hope faded as he saw Lysander bring his thunderhammer down on the control panel, destroying it utterly. Realizing that his star fort was doomed, Gormak roused his boys for one last charge. The war boss's fury drove him on through the hail of bolter fire. Roaring with the joy of slaughter, Gormak tore a Centurion apart. But then the fallen Battle Brothers squadmates drove their siege drills forward, and the war boss was torn to a mangled mess of flesh and bone. With Gormak's fall, the Orks' enthusiasm faltered, and the Sentinels of Terra quickly seized the opportunity to withdraw. Already the air was filled with tortured groaning of metal, as the starfort, never intended to enter atmosphere, began to surrender to gravity's remorseless embrace. The docking spur, its integrity already undermined by the cruiser's impact, sheared off entirely and began its own lazy descent into Vaishan's atmosphere. Gyrodon felt a moment of dread. If the docking spur was gone, it was entirely possible that the extraction Thunderhawks had been lost as well, severing his company's escape route. Fortunately, comms traffic quickly confirmed that the attack craft had left the cruiser's hold the moment the starfort began to shift. Solar minutes later, carefully matching their approach to the starfort's lazy yaw, the pilots had set down in a hangar bay beneath the command deck, and the surviving Space Marines at last made their escape. A few defense batteries gave half-hearted volleys at the retreating Thunderhawk gunships, but only a few. The vast majority of the Orks had abandoned their stations in search of escape pods or functional void ships. Most would fail. As previously arranged, the Storm of Wrath's fleet was once more headed in system. Behind it spiraled a trail of wreckage from where several Ork vessels, too eager for the kill, had strayed into weapons range. A score of greenskin vessels, a mixture of cruisers and battleships, still pursued the battle barge. However, most of the Ork starships were arrayed in battle formations against the newcomers on the edge of the Vishan system. The tides of the warp had been kind, and the Numian fleet had arrived earlier than projected. Though there were not enough Imperial Navy vessels to bring the Orks to battle, there were too many for the greenskins to ignore. Now, like a wolf torn between a choice of prey, the Orks risked losing both. And so it proved. Soon after the Third Company's Thunderhawks touched down in the Storm of Wrath's forward bay. After a brief broadside duel with a battlecruiser, the Storm of Wrath entered the warp, and the Nemean fleet making a similar withdrawal moments later. Meanwhile, the dark silhouette of the starfort began to glow red as Vaishan 1 took revenge on its despoiler. By the time the Storm of Wrath had returned to Kalin, Gyrodon had drawn plans to end the Orks of the Magor Rift for good. With their base of resupply destroyed, the greenskin starships would be easy prey for the Imperial Navy, and once the fleet was driven off, the Crusade of Thunder would retake Vaishan from its brutish conquerors. Lysander concurred with his sergeant's appraisal of the situation and ordered the Storm of Wrath to break orbit. As he did so, however, Apostolary Darsway received an urgent message from the Phalanx. A Tyranid infestation had taken root in the Drashin system. At less than 100 light-years from Terra, this placed the rapacious Xenos a merely stone's throw away from the Imperium's heart. Accordingly, and at Vladimir Pug's order, all Imperial strike forces, including the Crusade of Thunder, were summarily recalled to confront this threat. The war with the Orks would have to wait. Now, I hope you enjoyed this box, so much so that you join us next week for the exciting conclusion to Lysander's struggles, along with his final duel with his most hated foe, Sean 2. Now, if you're still listening to this, then if you could be so kind as to push that subscribe, like, or follow button, and if you wish to help us expand our work on 40k lore, by all means support us by joining our membership program
on our YouTube channel, Tales of Ashwaka.
Have a great day. And as always,
Until next time, this is Zeckthar, signing off.